The rain didn't fall in Arizona, it attacked. It came in violent, wind-driven sheets that turned the desert dust into a muddy torrent and the sky into a bruised purple canvas. Thunder cracked overhead, not as a distant rumble, but as a sharp, concussive blast that vibrated through the concrete floor of the garage. For Sarah, the storm was just noise, a familiar soundtrack to the lonely nights at Sarah's last stop, the only beacon of light for 50 miles of barren highway. The garage's neon sign, a flickering blue wrench, cast erratic shadows across the cavernous space. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the storm, hot metal, and the comforting aroma of old grease. At 47, Sarah moved with the unhurried economy of someone who had long since mastered their craft and had nothing left to prove. Her hands, calloused and stained, could diagnose an engine's ailment by sound alone. She wore her past like a faded tattoo, visible if you knew where to look, but mostly hidden beneath a layer of weary competence. This garage, this stretch of forgotten highway, was her self-imposed exile, her penance. A pair of headlights cut through the deluge, impossibly bright. They belonged to a vehicle moving far too fast for the treacherous conditions. Sarah watched from the bay door as a long, black car hydroplaned for a terrifying moment before the driver wrestled it back under control. It wasn't the sputtering pickup of a local rancher or the overheated sedan of a lost tourist. This was something else entirely. The car, a vintage 1965 Lincoln Continental, slid into her lot with the wounded grace of a fallen predator, its engine letting out a final, metallic screech before dying completely. Silence descended, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the tin roof. For a long minute, nothing happened. Sarah didn't move. In her world, you learn to wait. You let the other person make the first move, show their hand. The driver's side door finally opened, and a man emerged into the storm. He was tall, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that was already being plastered to his frame by the rain. He didn't run or shield his face. He simply stood there, his presence sucking the air out of the night. Even from a distance, Sarah could feel it, a chilling stillness, the kind that precedes violence. He walked toward the garage, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the mud. He moved like a man who owned every piece of ground he stood on, even this desolate patch of desert. As he stepped under the awning and into the light, Sarah got her first clear look. He was in his late 50s, his face a roadmap of hard living and quiet authority. His graying black hair was slicked back, and his eyes, dark and deep-set, missed nothing. A fresh, angry red scratch ran along his jawline, a single flaw in an otherwise perfectly composed mask. He stopped just inside the bay, dripping water onto the oil-stained floor. His gaze swept over the garage, taking in the hanging tools, the half-disassembled engine block, and finally Sarah herself. There was no surprise, no judgment. It was the detached assessment of a general surveying a new piece of terrain. "You the mechanic?" His voice was a low gravel, laced with the unmistakable accent of the Chicago outfit. Sarah wiped her hands on a rag, her movements deliberate. "I am. Looks like you've had a rough night." He ignored the comment. "The car won't start. It needs to be fixed, tonight." Sarah let out a slow breath, the kind that wasn't quite a sigh. She walked past him, out into the rain, her boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. She didn't need his permission to inspect the vehicle. It was her garage, her rules. The Lincoln was a work of art, a four-wheeled fortress. The black paint was deep enough to drown in, but her experienced eye caught the subtle details, the slight thickness of the windows, the reinforced seams along the door panels. A long, fresh gash marred the passenger side, deeper than any stray branch could have caused. This wasn't a breakdown. This was the aftermath of a fight. She popped the hood. The engine was a monster, a custom-built 462 V8, but it was unnaturally clean, except for a fine metallic dust coating a section near the firewall. One of the main battery cables was completely severed, not frayed or corroded, but cut, cleanly. She closed the hood with a solid thud and turned to face him, the rain plastering her own hair to her face. "Your engine didn't die," she stated, her voice flat. "It was killed. That cable was cut by a thermite charge. Small, professional, designed to disable the vehicle without causing a fire." The man's expression didn't change. But a new light entered his eyes. Respect. He had expected a grease-stained local, not an expert in vehicular sabotage. "Can you fix it?" he asked, the demand in his voice softening ever so slightly into a genuine question. "I can fix anything," Sarah replied, "but a job like this, with custom parts you won't find at the local auto shop, it'll take time, and it'll be expensive. Money is not the issue, time is." He pulled a thick roll of $100 bills from his jacket pocket and peeled off 5, placing them on the workbench. "For your trouble tonight, get started. I need a room. I run a garage, not a hotel. There's a motel 10 miles down the road. If you can get a signal to call a cab." For the first time, the man's composure cracked with a flicker of impatience. "I'm not leaving the vehicle." His tone made it clear this was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. Sarah held his gaze. She had seen men like him before, in another life. Men who spoke in ultimatums and carried the weight of unspoken threats in their silence. She had run a long way to get away from them, but running was for the young. Now she just wanted to be left alone. "There's a small office in the back with a couch that's seen better days," she said, turning away. "Coffee's stale, but it's hot. Don't touch anything." She spent the next 4 hours working under the harsh glare of the work lights. The storm raged outside, a fitting backdrop to the tension inside the garage. The man, he hadn't offered a name, and she hadn't asked, sat in the shadows of the office, a silent, imposing figure. He never took his eyes off her or the car. Sarah worked with a focused intensity, blocking him out, losing herself in the familiar language of wires, steel, and oil. She bypassed the severed cable, rerouting the connection with a heavy-gauge wire she normally used for welding rigs. It was a temporary fix, ugly but effective. At 3:17 a.m., she wiped the last of the grease from her hands and turned the ignition key. The massive engine roared to life, a deep, throaty growl that filled the garage and drowned out the storm. The man was on his feet instantly, moving out of the office and toward the car. "It'll hold," Sarah said over the rumble. "Long enough to get you where you're going, but you'll need a full system replacement." He nodded, pulling out the roll of cash again. "How much?" "5,000, she said without blinking. It was an outrageous price. A test. He didn't even flinch. He counted out $100 bills and placed them next to the first 5. "And for your silence." "My silence isn't for sale," she said, pushing the extra 500 back toward him. "The 5,000 covers the work and the don't ask, don't tell tax. Standard policy for late-night visitors in a hurry." He looked at her, then at the money, and a slow, cold smile touched his lips. It wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of a king acknowledging a peer. He pocketed the 500. As he prepared to leave, Sarah's gaze fell on the car's front grille. Something was wedged behind the chrome, a small piece of twisted metal, dark and unfamiliar. It must have been picked up during whatever skirmish he'd been in. Acting on an instinct she hadn't felt in years, she reached in with a pair of pliers and pulled it free. She held it up to the light. It was a piece of shrapnel, but the metal was strange, lightweight, with a faint, iridescent sheen. The man froze, his hand on the car door. He had seen what she was holding. Sarah turned the piece of metal over in her palm. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the engine's roar like a razor. "Titanium alloy, layered for kinetic dispersal. The kind of stuff they use in reinforced body panels for motorcades. Corporate security, maybe, or..." She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of her knowledge settle in the air between them. She finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "This piece doesn't belong to some backroad thug's pickup truck. This came off something serious. The kind of car that protects something, or someone, very important. Your Lincoln didn't just get into a fight, it won." She placed the piece of metal on the workbench, next to his pile of money. "So the question isn't who you're running from," she said, her voice dropping lower, each word landing with the impact of a hammer blow. "It's what you took from them." The man, Marco the Ghost Bellini, a name whispered with fear in the darkest corners of Chicago, stood utterly still. The mask of cold authority had vanished, or replaced by a look of profound, dangerous shock. For the second time that night, This woman in the middle of nowhere had looked past the car, past the money, and had seen the truth. She hadn't just fixed his engine. She had read his entire story in a single piece of shrapnel. The desert was no longer a hiding place. It had just become the most dangerous place on Earth because it contained the one thing he could no longer afford, a witness who understood far too much. The engine's deep growl was the only sound in the universe. It swallowed the dying hiss of the rain and the nervous beat of Sarah's own heart. Marco Bellini stood motionless, his face a mask of stone. But his eyes were a different story. They were alive with a storm of their own, shock, calculation, and a grudging, dangerous respect. The power dynamic, once so clear, had been shattered and reforged in the space of a single sentence. He was no longer a powerful man inconvenienced in a backwater town. She was no longer a simple mechanic. They were two players in a game he thought he was playing alone. He broke the silence first. His voice, when it came, was stripped of its earlier authority, replaced by a cold, quiet intensity. "You have a good eye." It wasn't a compliment. It was an admission. An admission that she was a threat, a complication he hadn't anticipated. "Comes from experience," Sarah replied, her tone level. She didn't back down, didn't look away. She had thrown the grenade. Now she would wait for the explosion. People who build cars like this are either running from something or protecting something. The modifications tell the story. This one, she gestured to the Lincoln, is telling a goddamn epic. Marco took a step closer, moving out of the harsh glare of the work lights and into the shadows where he seemed more comfortable. "What else does it tell you?" "It tells me you're not a fool. The thermite charge was a warning shot, meant to strand you, not kill you. Whoever is after you wants what's in this car more than they want you dead. At least for now." She leaned against the workbench, crossing her arms. It was a posture of casual defiance, a signal that she was not intimidated. "Which brings me back to my question. What did you take?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked slowly around the Lincoln, his fingers tracing the gash on its side as if reading a line of Braille. He was buying time, assessing her, recalibrating his entire strategy. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "The name is Marco," he said finally, turning to face her. "And what I have is a private matter. What I need from you is to finish the permanent repairs on this vehicle and to forget everything you've seen tonight." Sarah let out a short, humorless laugh. "Forget? A man like you, a car like this, and a professional hit right on my doorstep? I've run a long way to build a life where I can forget things. You just drag my past right back into the present. Forgetting is no longer on the menu, Marco. So you have two options. You can take your car and your cash and get the hell out of my garage right now with its temporary fix. Or you can tell me what kind of storm you brought down on my head so I can decide if I want to help you ride it out." He stared at her, a long, unnerving appraisal. He was weighing the risk of leaving a knowledgeable witness behind versus the risk of bringing one along. She saw the decision form in his eyes before he spoke. "I can't leave. Not yet. The parts for a full repair, they are not easily acquired." "Everything's acquirable for the right price," Sarah countered, already knowing his game. "I have a contact in Phoenix who deals in specialized automotive supplies. He owes me a favor, but he's not cheap and he doesn't like attention." "Get the parts," Marco commanded. "Whatever the cost. I'll stay here until it's done." "You're not hearing me. This is my garage. You don't give the orders here." She held his gaze. "I make the call. And in return for that call, I get an answer. What did you take?" Before he could respond, a new sound cut through the night. Not thunder, but the low crunch of tires on wet gravel. Headlights swept across the garage entrance. A late-model black sedan, clean and anonymous, pulled to a stop just outside the bay, its engine purring quietly. Two men got out. They weren't dressed for the desert. They wore dark suits, city shoes, and expressions that were professionally blank. Marco's entire body went rigid. He didn't reach for a weapon, but his hands subtly shifted inside his jacket. His eyes flickered to Sarah, a silent, urgent command. "Stay back." Sarah didn't move. She had seen this play out before. The quiet arrival, the polite but menacing posture. This was the first wave. One of the men stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Marco. completely ignoring Sarah. "Mr. Bellini," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "Vincent sends his regards. He's concerned about your health after your abrupt departure. He would like you to come home." "I'm touched by his concern," Marco replied, his voice dripping with ice. "Tell Vincent I'm enjoying my retirement." "He was very specific," the man continued, taking another step. "He said to tell you that the family needs its ledger. That business is untidy without it. He's willing to forgive your transgression if you return what is rightfully his." The ledger. So that was it. Not jewels, not drugs. Information. The most dangerous commodity of all. The man's partner began to circle around toward the Lincoln, his intentions clear. Sarah knew she had seconds to act. This wasn't just Marco's fight anymore. They were in her sanctuary. With a speed that defied her age, she grabbed a heavy, four-way lug wrench from the wall. "This is private property," she said, her voice ringing out with cold authority. "And that car is under my care. Nobody touches it." The second man smirked, dismissing her as a minor annoyance. He continued toward the Lincoln. "I warned you," Sarah said calmly. She moved to a control panel on the wall, her hand hovering over a large, greasy red button. "That Lincoln is sitting on hydraulic lift number 2. It's rated for 10,000 pounds. Your partner, however, is not." The man stopped, his smirk faltering as he looked up. The massive arms of the lift were positioned directly above him, a multi-ton guillotine waiting for a command. His partner froze, his hand reaching inside his own jacket. "Your move, city boy," Sarah said, her finger resting on the button. The first man turned his full attention to Sarah for the first time, his professional mask cracking with disbelief. He had expected a gun, a knife, maybe a panicked phone call. He had not expected this. Marco seized the opportunity. In a blur of motion, he closed the distance to the first man. There was a sickening crack of bone as Marco's elbow connected with the man's nose. As the second man drew his weapon, Marco was already moving, using the first man's body as a shield. There was a muffled cough from a silenced pistol in Marco's hand. The second man crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. The first man, dazed and bleeding, was dispatched with a second, equally quiet shot. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The clinical, brutal efficiency of it all left Sarah breathless. Marco stood over the bodies, his chest heaving slightly, the small pistol looking like a toy in his large hand. He looked at Sarah, his eyes dark with the violence he had just unleashed. "Now you see," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is the storm." Sarah didn't flinch. She lowered her hand from the control panel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had seen violence before, but this was different. This was the work of an apex predator. She walked over to the dead men, her gaze professional and detached. "They'll have a GPS tracker on their car, and they won't be the only team Vincent sent. They'll be missed in an hour, maybe less." Marco was already dragging the bodies into the deepest, darkest corner of the garage. "Help me with the car. We need to get it inside. Out of sight." Together they pushed the heavy sedan into the bay. Sarah lowered the massive garage door, the heavy metal clanking shut, sealing them inside. The world outside disappeared. Now it was just the two of them. Two bodies and a secret that was about to get them both killed. "The ledger," Sarah said, turning to him, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "It's time you tell me everything." Marco finally relented. The immediate threat had broken down his final wall of secrecy. He leaned against the blood-spattered Lincoln, the mask of the invincible Don gone, replaced by the weary expression of a man cornered. "My younger cousin Vincent," he began, his voice heavy with betrayal. "He was always ambitious, always hungry. I brought him up, taught him the business. I treated him like a son. While I was consolidating our legitimate enterprises, he was making deals behind my back, cutting into the drug trade, things my father swore we'd never touch. He built his own power base within my family." He looked at the bodies with disgust. "He made his move last week, called a meeting, claimed I was getting soft, that I'd lost my edge. He had half the capos on his side. It was a coup. I was given a choice, retire and disappear, or be erased. And you chose to disappear," Sarah finished for him. "I did," Marco said, "but not without taking out some insurance." He walked to the Lincoln and pressed a hidden button under the dashboard. A panel behind the back seat clicked open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a single, leather-bound book. This is the family ledger. Every deal, every payment, every name, every secret for the last 30 years. It implicates Vincent in a dozen different crimes, including the murder of a federal witness. It's the one thing that can destroy him. So you're planning on using it as leverage, Sarah deduced. Not just leverage, Marco's eyes hardened. He made a mistake. He thinks my only heir, my daughter, is studying art in Florence. He's been using her as a veiled threat, a way to keep me in line. He doesn't know I moved her to a secure location 6 months ago. But as long as he thinks he has that power over me, he will never stop hunting me. This ledger is the only thing that will force him to the table and guarantee her safety, permanently. He closed the compartment, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Vincent will not stop. He will send more men, better men. They will find this garage. They will burn it to the ground to get to that book. Sarah looked around her garage, her home, her fortress of solitude. It had been breached. She thought about the life she had painstakingly built from the ashes of her old one. The quiet, the anonymity. It was all gone. The contact in Phoenix, she said, her voice all business now. He can get me the parts I need by dawn, but we'll need more than that. We need to turn this car from a target into a weapon. Marco looked at her, a flicker of hope in his dark eyes. What do you have in mind? Sarah's lips curved into a grim, determined smile. You said you wanted a permanent fix. Fine, I'll give you one. I'll rebuild this engine to outrun anything Vincent can throw at us. We can reinforce the suspension, add a few surprises under the hood. By the time I'm done, this Lincoln won't just be a classic car. It'll be a ghost. Your ghost. She picked up a wrench, the cold steel feeling solid and real in her hand. But it's going to take all night, and we're on the clock. You handle the bodies, I'll handle the machine. As Sarah went to work, a new dynamic settled between them. They were no longer a customer and a mechanic. They were allies, bound by a shared threat and a desperate need to survive. The garage was no longer just a place of business. It was their Alamo, their last stand. And as the first light of dawn threatened to break across the Arizona desert, they both knew that their race against time had just begun. The desert sunrise did little to warm the cold reality inside the garage. Dawn broke not with a gentle glow, but with the harsh, unforgiving light of a crime scene. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air sharp and cool. Inside, the smell of blood and cordite hung faintly beneath the dominant scent of gasoline. The two bodies were gone. Marco had worked through the pre-dawn hours with a grim, silent efficiency that spoke of long practice. He had taken the assassin's sedan, along with its occupants, and driven deep into the labyrinthine canyons miles from the highway. He returned just as the sky was turning from charcoal to a bruised lavender, his shoes dusty, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak of what he had done. He didn't have to. Sarah knew some secrets were better left buried under tons of rock and sand. She hadn't slept. Fueled by stale coffee and a surge of adrenaline that felt chillingly familiar, she had spent the night in a feverish trance of creation. The garage, once her sanctuary of solitude, had become a war room, a field hospital for a wounded iron beast. The Lincoln sat on the central lift, stripped of its wheels, its guts exposed under the glare of fluorescent lights. Tools lay scattered around it like surgical instruments. This was no longer a repair. It was a resurrection. Marco moved to the coffee pot, pouring a cup of the black sludge. He watched her work, his presence a heavy weight in the quiet garage. The dynamic between them had shifted again. They were no longer adversaries or cautious allies. They were co-conspirators, their fates now welded together as surely as the steel plates she was bolting to the Lincoln's chassis. Phoenix, she said, not looking up from the brake line she was reinforcing. My guy's name is Whiskey Jack. He's expecting a call. He only talks on a secure line. She nodded toward a battered flip phone sitting on the workbench. Marco picked it up. It was a relic from another era, anonymous and untraceable. He handed it to her. Sarah wiped her greasy hands on a rag, punched in a number from memory, and put the phone on speaker. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered, thick with suspicion. Yeah, it's Sarah, from Philly. There was a long pause. The voice on the other end lost some of its edge, replaced by a note of wary surprise. Sarah, Jesus, I thought you were a ghost. Heard you bought it in that pile-up outside Atlantic City. The rumors of my death were greatly exaggerated, Sarah said flatly. I need a package, a rush job, and it's specialized. I'm out of the specialization game, Sarah. I run a legitimate custom shop now. Bullshit. Jack, she shot back. You've never been legitimate a day in your life. I need a full drivetrain assembly for a 65 Continental. Carburetor, transmission, the works. But I need the law enforcement interceptor package. And I need 3 extra sheets of military-grade Kevlar paneling, a gallon of 2-part epoxy, and a case of self-sealing run-flat tires. The big ones. Another long silence. Whiskey Jack was doing the math, calculating the risk, the heat she was bringing down. That's not a car you're building, Sarah. That's a goddamn battering ram. Who are you pissing off these days? The kind of people who send professionals to cut your battery cables with thermite, she replied. A low whistle came through the speaker. Chicago boys? You don't need to know. Can you get it or not? I'll have a wire transfer in your account in 10 minutes. My usual rate, plus 50% for the headache. This is more than a headache, Sarah. This is a migraine with a body count. You're playing in a league that doesn't have a retirement plan. I'm already retired, she said. I'm just trying to stay that way. Can you do it? The sigh on the other end was heavy. The parts are in a warehouse in Scottsdale. Getting them to you without a tail, it's risky. I can have a truck roll by noon, but it'll be a hot drop. He won't stop, just slow down. You'll have one chance to make the pickup. After that, you're on your own, and you lose this number. Understood, Sarah said and ended the call. She looked at Marco. Noon. He'll drop the parts on the access road behind the garage. She turned back to the Lincoln. That gives me less than 6 hours to get the chassis ready. Marco watched her, a look of grudging admiration on his face. You were more than just a driver, weren't you? Sarah didn't stop working, her hands moving with practiced confidence. My ex-husband, Leo, he was the face of the operation. Ambitious, charming, and dumber than a bag of hammers. He had the muscle, but I had the maps. I planned the routes, I built the cars, I timed the jobs. He just had to follow the plan. What happened? He got greedy, she said, her voice tight. Last job, a payroll heist. Easy in, easy out. But he saw an unlocked vault, a bigger score. He broke protocol, stayed inside too long, tripped a silent alarm. By the time he got out, the cops were everywhere. Her hands stilled for a second. He had a backup plan I didn't know about, one that involved him getting away clean and me and our partner taking the fall. He tried to lock me in the getaway car and leave me for the cops to find. What did you do? I did what I had to do to survive, she said, her voice turning to ice. I drove the car through the wall of a donut shop, created a diversion, and walked out the back in the chaos. I never saw him again. Read in the paper he got 25 years. His crew thinks I ran off with the money. The cops think I burned in the crash. I came out here to make sure they all kept thinking that. She finally looked at him, her eyes holding a reflection of his own violent past. We're not so different, you and I. We were both betrayed by family. Only difference is, you're trying to get back in. I'm just trying to stay out. Marco was silent for a long time. He walked to the hidden compartment in the Lincoln and took out the leather ledger. He didn't open it. He just held it, as if feeling its weight. This isn't about getting back in, he said quietly. It's about buying freedom. He pulled a worn photograph from his wallet and handed it to her. It was a picture of a young woman with his same dark eyes, but her smile was warm and genuine. She was standing in front of a canvas, her hands and clothes smeared with paint. My daughter, Isabella. The pride in his voice was a raw, vulnerable thing. She's an artist, a real one. She thinks I run a shipping and logistics company. She has no idea where the money that paid for her education in Florence really came from. She's clean, Sarah. She's the one good, clean thing in my entire life. He took the photo back, handling it with a reverence that seemed out of place for a man of his profession. Vincent knows about her. He thinks she's my weakness. As long as he's in power, he will always hold her over my head, a shadow over her life. This ledger, it's not just to destroy him. It contains evidence linking his faction to a federal crime. If I give it to the right people, I can trade it for a guarantee. Not just immunity for me, but a legal firewall that separates Isabella from the family name, from the business forever. It's her one chance at a normal life. Sarah looked from the photo to the ledger and finally understood. This wasn't about a power struggle. It was about a father trying to save his child in the only way he knew how. The mission suddenly felt different. It was no longer just about survival. It was about something close to redemption. The hours that followed were a blur of focused, frantic work. At 11:45, they were ready. They had cleared a path to the back of the garage. The tension was a living thing, a third person in the room with them. Right on schedule, a beat-up flatbed truck appeared on the horizon, kicking up a plume of dust. It slowed as it passed the back of the garage, and two large, heavy crates slid off the back, hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud. The truck never stopped. By the time Sarah and Marco had dragged the crates inside, it was just a speck in the distance. They worked in a synchronized, unspoken rhythm, tearing open the crates. Inside was a mechanical paradise, a gleaming new transmission, heavy-duty suspension coils, sheets of Kevlar, and the set of menacing run-flat tires. But as Sarah began to unpack the last crate, she saw something else. Tucked beneath a set of gaskets was a small sealed envelope. Her name was scrawled on it in Whiskey Jack's messy handwriting. She tore it open. Inside was a satellite phone and a single chilling note. They weren't just watching me. They were tracking the parts. They know where you are. Get out now. As if on cue, a low hum started in the distance. It grew steadily louder, the distinct, menacing chop of helicopter blades. Marco was already moving, grabbing the ledger and his pistol. They're here. The helicopter appeared over the ridge, a black dragonfly against the stark blue sky. It wasn't police. It was a private, unmarked aircraft, the kind used for corporate transport or tactical insertions. It circled the garage once, a hawk surveying its prey, before landing a quarter-mile down the highway, kicking up a storm of dust and gravel. Doors slid open, and four men in black tactical gear deployed, moving toward the garage with military precision. They were being hunted. The small window of time they thought they had just slammed shut. "We're not going to make it," Marco said, his voice grim as he peered through a grimy window. "The car isn't ready. We're trapped." Sarah looked at the Lincoln, her half-finished masterpiece. She looked at the approaching figures. Her mind, the same mind that planned escape routes and timed heists, went into overdrive. She saw the variables, the angles, the possibilities. Running was no longer an option, so they would have to fight. Suddenly, the satellite phone in her hand buzzed. An unknown number. She looked at Marco. He nodded. She answered, putting it on speaker. A new voice filled the garage. It was calm, cultured, and utterly chilling. "Mr. Bellini, this is Mr. Sterling. I'm a consultant hired by your cousin to facilitate the recovery of his property. My team is now in position outside your location. I'm here to offer you a final, civilized solution." "I'm listening," Marco growled. "The woman is an unforeseen complication," Sterling continued, his tone as smooth as polished marble. "An innocent caught in the crossfire. My employer is a reasonable man. He is prepared to let her walk away. Give us the ledger, Mr. Bellini, and she gets to live out her days in this dusty paradise. Resist, and this garage becomes her tomb. You have 60 seconds to decide." The line went dead. Marco looked at Sarah, his face a mask of agony. The impossible choice was laid bare before him. The ledger that could save his daughter, or the life of the woman standing beside him. He reached for the book, but Sarah was already moving. She looked at the Lincoln, at the approaching men, at the utter desperation in Marco's eyes. A lifetime of running, of being a victim of other men's greed and betrayal, coalesced into a single defiant point of pure, cold rage. She took the satellite phone from his hand. She found the number in the recent calls and hit dial. Sterling answered on the first ring. "I assume you've made the sensible choice." "You're talking to the wrong person," Sarah said, her voice pure ice. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline, dangerous calm. There was a brief pause on the other end. "The mechanic. The complication. The name is Sarah. And you're new at this, aren't you?" she said, her words dripping with condescending authority. "If you wanted to make a deal, you should have come with a better offer. You want this ledger? It's here. But my price is your boss, Vincent. Delivered to this garage. Gift wrapped. You tell that backstabbing snake that Sarah from Philly sends her regards, and that after tonight, he's going to need a new consultant." She hung up before he could respond. She turned to Marco, who was staring at her as if he'd never seen her before. He thought he had found a skilled mechanic, a fellow survivor. He was wrong. In that moment, surrounded by the tools of her trade, with an army at her door, Sarah had reclaimed the part of herself she had tried to bury in the desert. He had found a queen, ready to go to war for her kingdom. "Get me that engine block mounted," she commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of a field general. "They wanted a storm? We're about to give them a goddamn hurricane." Sterling's silence on the other end of the line was more eloquent than any threat. It was the sound of a perfectly controlled world being thrown into chaos by an unknown variable. He had calculated every angle based on Marco Bellini, the aging Don. He had not and could not have calculated for Sarah. The line went dead with a soft click, the prelude to a war she had just formally declared. Marco stared at her, the ledger momentarily forgotten in his hand. The shock in his eyes had melted away, replaced by something she'd never seen before. A flicker of raw, unadulterated hope. He had come here to hide, to bargain from a position of weakness. He had been prepared to sacrifice everything. Sarah had just shown him a different path. Not retreat, not surrender, but victory. "Sarah from Philly," he said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Leo's wife, the one they called the ghost driver. I heard the stories. They said you could make a getaway car disappear on a one-way street." "Leo was a fool who talked too much," Sarah said, her voice sharp as she began to move, her mind already a whirlwind of tactical calculations. "He's in a cage. I'm still here. That's the only story that matters now." She pointed to the half-assembled Lincoln. "You wanted a weapon? You're about to get one. But it won't be enough. This garage is our home field. It's time we gave the visiting team a proper welcome." What followed was a masterclass in improvised warfare. The garage transformed. It was no longer a place for repairs. It was a killing floor, designed by a master architect of mechanical mayhem. They worked with a frantic, telepathic synergy, their shared pasts of violence and survival creating a bond stronger than steel. Marco, using his brute strength, moved heavy engine blocks and tool chests, creating choke points and barricades. He positioned sheets of steel like shields, turning a simple workbench into a fortified bunker. His movements were economical and precise, the actions of a man who understood the geometry of a firefight, but the true artistry belonged to Sarah. She was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of destruction. She rerouted the high-pressure lines from the pneumatic air compressor, turning them into tripwires that would unleash deafening blasts of air, disorienting anyone who crossed them. She loosened the safety bolts on the heaviest hydraulic lift, positioning a stripped Ford F-150 chassis directly above the main entrance, held in place by a single, fragile-looking pin connected to a remote trigger. She ran a cable from the industrial arc welder to a metal plate hidden beneath a shallow pool of spilled oil near the side door, creating a high-voltage trap. "They'll cut the power first," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space as she worked. "They'll want to use night vision, take away our eyes." She rigged a backup battery to a single string of low-wattage emergency lights, just enough to create menacing shadows and silhouettes, turning the familiar space into a terrifying maze. "And when they come through that door?" Marco asked, loading a spare magazine for his pistol. Sarah picked up a pneumatic nail gun, the kind used for framing, and attached it to a portable CO2 canister. The heavy-gauge nails were 3 inches long. "They'll find out that I run a full-service garage," she said, her eyes glinting in the dim light. They finished with minutes to spare. The low hum of the helicopter had been replaced by an unnerving silence. Then, as Sarah had predicted, the main lights flickered and died. The garage plunged into a disorienting semi-darkness, the emergency lights casting long, distorted shadows. They were blind. The first breach was subtle, a soft click at the lock on the side door. The door swung open, and a figure clad in black tactical gear stepped inside, rifle raised, night vision goggles glowing a faint alien green. He moved with practiced silence. He took 2 steps, his boots splashing into the pool of oil. From her perch in the darkened office above, Sarah hit the switch. A brilliant blue-white arc of electricity erupted from the metal plate. The man convulsed, his body lit up in a horrific, silent dance, before collapsing with a heavy thud. One down. An earpiece crackled to life on the dead man's vest. Sterling's voice, still impossibly calm. "Bravo, team, report. What was that?" Before anyone could answer, the main bay door began to groan, not opening, but being forced inward by a hydraulic ram. Marco was in position behind the steel-plated workbench. "3 more coming through the front," he whispered into a small radio Sarah had given him. "Let them get inside," she whispered back. The massive door buckled, then tore open with a screech of tortured metal. 3 figures flowed inside, moving in a tight, professional formation, their weapons sweeping the shadows. They moved past the hanging chains and engine hoists, deeper into the maze. As the last man cleared the entrance, Sarah pressed the remote trigger. The pin retracted. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of stressed metal, the 10,000-pound chassis of the F-150 fell. It didn't just crash. It obliterated the space where the men had been standing moments before. The impact shaking the very foundation of the building and sending a shockwave of dust and debris through the air. 2 of the men were crushed instantly. The third, knocked off his feet by the shockwave, scrambled to recover, his night vision goggles shattered. He was a blind man in a dark room. A single, silent shot from Marco's position ended his struggle. "Status, Sterling!" Marco's voice boomed through the garage, a taunt to the man he knew was listening. "Your team seems to be having some mechanical difficulties." There was a pause, then Sterling's voice came back, no longer calm, but laced with a thin wire of fury. "Impressive, mechanic, but you can't hide in there forever." Suddenly, the windows of the office where Sarah was hidden exploded inward. It wasn't a bullet. It was a concussion grenade, designed to stun, not kill. The world dissolved into a blinding white light and a piercing, high-frequency scream. Sarah was thrown from her chair, her ears ringing, her vision swimming. Through the shattered window, a figure rappelled down from the roof. Sterling himself, clad in black, a pistol in his hand. He had bypassed their traps, creating his own entrance. He saw Sarah on the floor, disoriented, and a cruel smile touched his lips. He raised his weapon, but as he did, the Lincoln Continental, which had been sitting dark and silent in the center of the garage, roared to life. Its headlights flashed on, blinding him. Sarah had left the keys in the ignition, the temporary wiring job a live circuit waiting for a command. With the last of her strength, she had fumbled for a second remote she had built, a simple remote starter. Marco was behind the wheel. The car, a wounded beast brought back for one last fight, fishtailed on the slick floor and charged directly at the office. Sterling fired twice, the bullets sparking harmlessly off the reinforced glass. He tried to dive out of the way, but the Lincoln was too fast. It didn't just hit the office, it annihilated it, crashing through the flimsy drywall and support beams, burying Sterling under a pile of splintered wood, shattered glass and office furniture. The Lincoln came to a stop in the wreckage, its engine rumbling like a contented beast. Marco leaped out, his gun ready, but it wasn't needed. Sterling was pinned, alive but broken. The garage fell silent again, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine. Sarah staggered out of the wreckage, bruised and bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but alive. She and Marco stood together in the center of the devastation, surrounded by the remnants of his army. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Not yet," Marco replied. He retrieved a small, high-frequency scanner from his pocket, a device Sarah had jury-rigged earlier. He hit the playback button. Sterling's voice, followed by another, filled the air. It was Vincent, his voice tinny and distant over the comms, giving the orders, demanding the ledger, telling Sterling to eliminate the complication at any cost. They had it all. Just then, a sleek black helicopter descended, its searchlight cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. It landed 50 yards from the garage. Vincent Bellini, confident his victory was assured, stepped out, flanked by two more guards. He walked toward the ruined garage, a triumphant smirk on his face. He stopped dead when he saw Marco and Sarah waiting for him, standing over the broken form of his top consultant. "Cousin," Marco said, his voice dangerously calm, "you've made a mess of my mechanic's garage. You're going to have to pay for the damages." Vincent's face contorted with rage as he saw his defeated team. He raised his own weapon. "Give me the book, old man." "The book is no longer yours to command," Sarah said, stepping forward. She held up the scanner, and Vincent's own incriminating voice echoed in the desert air. "This recording, along with a copy of the ledger, is currently being uploaded to a very secure, very private server. If anything happens to us, it gets sent to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country. Your empire will be in ashes by noon." Vincent froze, the color draining from his face. He was trapped. "Here's the new deal," Marco continued, taking his place beside Sarah. "You are going to guarantee Isabella's complete and permanent separation from the family. You will establish a trust in her name that will make her independently wealthy for the rest of her life. You will personally ensure that no one from our world ever contacts her again. In addition, you will cede control of the family's three most profitable, legitimate front companies to a new holding corporation." He gestured to Sarah, "one that she will control." It was a masterstroke, not just a truce, but a strategic dismantling of Vincent's power, a crippling blow from which he would never recover. Vincent stared at them, his face a mask of pure hatred. He had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and utterly defeated by an old man and a small-town mechanic. He lowered his weapon. "Deal!" The sun was fully risen now, casting a golden glow over the scene of carnage. The garage was a wreck, but it stood defiant. A few months later, the sign outside still read, "Sarah's last stop." But the garage itself was new, rebuilt with reinforced steel and state-of-the-art security. Inside, a different Lincoln Continental, a fully restored 1966 model, sat gleaming in the bay. Sarah was under the hood, tuning the engine, her hands still stained with grease, but the weary look in her eyes was gone. Marco brought her a glass of iced tea, his movements relaxed. The weight of a lifetime of paranoia finally lifted. A car pulled up, and Isabella got out, running to hug her father. She smiled at Sarah, a warm, genuine smile of gratitude. She was safe. She was free. Later that evening, Sarah and Marco sat on the office steps, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The ledger sat on the workbench, its power now theirs to wield. "We make a good team," Marco said, his voice filled with a quiet contentment he had never known. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, the cold steel of a wrench still in her hand. "That we do." They had faced the storm and won. They hadn't run from their pasts. They had turned them into weapons, into armor. This garage, once a place of exile, had become their fortress, their home. It was no longer a stop on the way to somewhere else. For the ghost driver and the exiled Don, it was the end of the line. It was their last stop.